In the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, an ordinary house hid an unspeakable horror. One night in 1912, the Moore family and two visiting girls were slaughtered with an axe, and the killer was never caught. Step inside the house that refuses to forget, where shadows linger, and the past refuses to stay buried. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of stories that will make you question whether you're truly alone right now. You're listening to Silent Scream Chronicles. Do well to subscribe, share, and hit the like button for more tales to come. And also let me know where you're listening from in the comments. The house on East 2nd Street had never been a place of shadows. Before the night that changed everything, it was nothing more than a modest, cheerful home. Painted white, trimmed neatly, maintained with the pride expected of a hardworking Midwestern family in 1912. Its walls had absorbed laughter, prayer, small daily celebrations, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Nothing about the structure suggested that it would one day become a shrine to terror. But houses are more than wood and nails. They carry impressions, absorb atmospheres, and react, however subtly, to what unfolds inside them. And somewhere in the quiet curve of early summer, the Moore residents began to shift. It was not obvious, not at first. A faint unease seemed to settle beneath the boards like a low, humming tension. A heaviness in the attic air. A whisper of something not quite right. If anyone noticed, they likely blamed the oppressive warmth of June or the exhaustion of rural life. No one imagined a darker origin. Small towns like Villisca often lived in a kind of contented isolation, tucked safely away from the turbulence of the wider world. Doors were rarely locked. Windows were left open to the breeze. Children ran freely down dirt roads and across open fields without fear of what might be hiding beyond their view. This unspoken trust was the backbone of every interaction, every shared moment, every glance exchanged at the church or the general store. The Moore family embodied that trust. Josiah, a man of dependable presence, carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who understood his responsibilities, to his work, to his family, to his faith. His wife, Sarah, held their household together with devotion and quiet strength. Their 4 children grew up in an environment shaped by warmth and discipline, their lives filled with small joys and structured days typical of the era. On June 9, 1912, the family's world revolved around the church's Children's Day program. The event was one of the highlights of the community calendar, drawing families together with a blend of music, scripture recitations, and wholesome fellowship. The Moore children were particularly excited. Their preparations had taken weeks, their anticipation building each day. Evening descended gently over Villisca as townspeople filed out of the church after the program. Families lingered on the steps, exchanging the soft laughter and easy conversation that belonged to uncomplicated times. The Moores stood among them, unaware that the world they knew had only hours left, unaware that a presence, one neither divine nor humanly kind, had already chosen them. The Stillinger sisters, Ina and Lena, were invited to spend the night with the Moore children after the festivities. It was a simple kindness, a gesture of hospitality common in close-knit communities. The girls accepted, blissfully unaware that their decision would intertwine their fates with the tragedy preparing to unfold. The walk home was peaceful, illuminated by lantern glow and the faint shimmer of stars peeking through clouds. The family moved together as a single cluster of contentment, their steps measured, their spirits calm. They entered the house at a reasonable hour, securing the doors with casual movements rather than necessity. Locking up wasn't an act of defense, just a habit. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that someone else was already inside the house. Something had infiltrated the space long before their return. Not a spiritual force, not a phantom, but something far more terrifying because of its humanity. A presence had slipped into the attic, ascending the small, narrow steps and settling among the shadows. It waited there, motionless and silent, listening to the sounds of the town below and the subtle creaks of the house around it. The intruder's patience was unnatural. Hours passed, each minute stretching into a long coil of silence. But the presence did not stir. It was accustomed to waiting, perhaps even comfortable in the stillness. The attic was suffocatingly warm, filled with the stale scent of dust and aged wood, but the figure endured the discomfort with sharp focus. It listened as the family moved about downstairs. It listened as the house embraced them. It listened as their footsteps slowed, softened, and eventually faded into the quiet rhythms of sleep. Only when the house grew completely still did the intruder shift. A faint movement, so subtle the air barely seemed to notice. The stillness of the attic tightened like a held breath. Below, the children slept. Sarah and Josiah lay in their room, nestled in the comfort of exhaustion after a long day. The Stillinger girls rested in the downstairs guest room, unaware that fate had led them into the center of a gathering storm. Midnight slid by, silent and unobserved, followed by the first hour of morning. Darkness pressed fully against the windows, unbroken by moonlight. Villisca slept deeply. The intruder waited. The house waited. And when the moment came, when it felt as if all the world existed in one held, breathless pause, the intruder began to descend from the attic. There was no hesitation. The movements were deliberate and slow, the kind of steps taken by someone who understood the nature of sound intimately. Every loose board was avoided, every shift of weight calculated. The figure emerged from the attic stair and moved through the second floor like a shadow given form. The axe, Josiah's own, was carried with unsettling familiarity. The master bedroom was first. The violence that unfolded was swift and merciless. It was not chaotic. It was not frenzied. It was controlled, calculated. The air itself seemed to resist the blows, as if the house understood the enormity of what was happening. But resistance meant nothing. The intruder continued with methodical determination, reshaping the room from a sanctuary into something unrecognizable. Once Sarah and Josiah lay motionless, the intruder moved toward the children's room. There was no pause, no change in pace, no hint of remorse. The small forms beneath the blankets were vulnerable, defenseless, unaware. The intruder acted with the same cold precision, extinguishing lives that had been moments away from countless tomorrows. Downstairs, the Stillinger sisters slept in the small guest bedroom. The violence that awaited them would be different, more chaotic, more revealing of the intruder's unraveling control. Something shifted in the atmosphere of that room. Panic, awareness, a brief struggle, but it made no difference. The outcome was the same, marked by a brutality even the intruder could not regulate. When the final blow fell, silence flooded the house with crushing weight. Yet the intruder did not leave. That was the part that would haunt investigators, townspeople, and historians for generations. The killer did not flee in panic or urgency. Instead, the presence wandered the house with a chilling calm, performing tasks that defied rational understanding. Lamps were moved. Mirrors were covered. The victims were rearranged, covered, positioned. Some objects were placed intentionally, as though part of an unseen ritual. Food was eaten. Time was spent. It was as if the intruder was not merely committing murder but completing a deeply personal process, one that required stillness afterward, as though the house itself needed to absorb the aftermath. Hours passed before the intruder finally vanished. The doors remained locked from the inside. The sun rose. The town awoke. And the house on East 2nd Street sat in unnatural silence. Morning light crept slowly across Villisca, brushing against rooftops and fences, stretching thin fingers toward the quiet house at the corner of East 2nd Street. It illuminated the porch, the curtains, the garden path, all serene in appearance, so deceptively ordinary that no passerby would suspect the forms lying cold and still behind those walls. The house, which had once radiated warmth, now sat like a vessel emptied of life. The stillness was wrong. Neighbors sensed it long before they acted on it. A house with children should never be this silent at mid-morning. On Sundays after a late night, perhaps, but not on Monday. Never on a weekday when chores and obligations called. The livestock needed tending. Breakfast needed preparing. Bread needed baking. Yet nothing stirred. A few women passing by on their errands glanced at the drawn shades. Some commented under their breath that the Moors must still be sleeping. Others noted the unusual quiet but dismissed it with a shrug. People minded their own business. If the Moores wanted a late morning, that was their choice. Still, a seed of unease began to take root in the minds of several neighbors as the hours stretched. By 8 a.m., questions were circulating. By 9 a.m., worry overshadowed politeness. By 10 a.m., the silence had become something else entirely, a presence unto itself, something pressing inward and outward at the same time, urging someone to act. It was well past 10 when a neighbor approached the porch, heart thudding with an instinctive dread she could not articulate. The front door was locked. Knocking yielded nothing but oppressive quiet. She peered through the windows, pressing her hands around her face to block the glare. The interior seemed dim, deserted, eerie. She stepped back, uncertainty clawing at her. Within minutes, others gathered, curiosity blending with concern bleeding into fear. Someone suggested checking on the family. Another offered to fetch Josiah's brother. Another wondered aloud if something terrible had happened. The house seemed to listen to their mounting anxiety, absorbing it into its boards like moisture into wood. When help arrived, the decision was made quickly. The presence of danger could no longer be ignored. A man stepped inside through a rear door that was usually left unlatched. He took one step into the dim kitchen, then another. The air was stale, thick, unmoving. A smell, faint but unmistakable, hung in the space. He approached the parlor and froze, breath catching. The first sight was enough. Fear exploded outward, swelling through the house, seeping through the open doorway, spreading across the lawn like an invisible mist. People recoiled as the news moved through them in gasps and whispered fragments. Someone ran for the marshal. Someone else collapsed to their knees. Others stood numb, as though the world had shifted in a way the mind could not process. The house, once breached, no longer hid its horror. It emanated it. Investigators arrived swiftly, but even they hesitated at the threshold. They stepped forward with caution, bracing themselves for what lay inside. The parlor bore the still forms of the two young visitors. The sight was devastating. 2 lives extinguished before their futures had properly begun. Upstairs, the horror intensified. The investigators moved through the second floor with somber dread, each footstep heavier than the last. In the master bedroom lay Josiah and Sarah, their bodies bearing the unmistakable signs of the violence inflicted upon them. The air in the room felt suffocating, as though the space itself remembered every blow. Down the hall, the children's bedroom was worse still. Innocence had met brutality, and the contrast was almost too much to endure. Experienced men found themselves stepping back, pressing fingers to their temples, fighting the creeping sickness rising in them. The crime was not simply murder, it was obliteration. The level of rage, the control, the ritualistic actions afterward, it all defied comprehension. The house absorbed the investigators' horror as it had absorbed the earlier violence. Every breath drawn inside its walls seemed to be swallowed, leaving behind a void thick with resonance. The structure felt too small to contain the enormity of what had been done inside it. Outside, townspeople gathered in clusters, voices trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. Some wept openly. Others stared in stunned silence. Children clung to parents, sensing the fear radiating from the adults. The news spread down streets and across fields until the entire town seemed to vibrate with dread. Villisca no longer felt safe. It felt violated. Inside the house, the investigators pieced together what little they could. The murder weapon, Josiah's own axe, had been left behind, propped in a way that suggested the killer did not fear being discovered or even pursued. Lamps had been moved, one left at the foot of the bed in a way that seemed almost symbolic. Mirrors were covered with pieces of clothing, as though the intruder could not stand to see their own reflection or the reflected aftermath of their deeds. A piece of meat and untouched food sat on the kitchen table, the small, eerie suggestion that the intruder had eaten or at least attempted to. The killer had shown no rush, no panic. They had worked through the house with method, returned to certain rooms and lingered. This was not the work of someone who acted in frenzy. It was someone who knew patients intimately, someone who had waited in the attic for hours before beginning the slaughter. Investigators examined the attic with tight, restrained breaths. The space bore evidence of occupation. Impressions on boxes, displaced dust, the faint indentation of someone having sat or crouched for an extended time. The air felt stale, oppressive, as though the presence of the intruder still clung to the rafters. Downstairs, the Stillinger girls' room revealed signs of a struggle. Lena's body position indicated that she had awakened, that she had seen something, understood something, perhaps even resisted. That room emitted a deeper sense of anguish than the others, as though the moment of awareness had left a psychic imprint too powerful for the structure to neutralize. Even as the decades passed, the attic remained the focal point of unease. Contractors refused to work in it for long. Inspectors described feeling pressure in their skulls, a faint dizziness, or an overwhelming desire to leave. One inspector reportedly fainted upon entering, claiming later that he felt something standing behind him, though nothing was observed. By the 1970s, locals spoke of the house with caution. The tragedy had become a story whispered across generations, yet its emotional reality remained fresh. Grandparents warned their grandchildren to avoid it. Parents found excuses to take alternate routes. Children watched the windows for movement, convinced that shadows shifted inside when no one was present. The house watched the town evolve, new buildings, changing vehicles, technology creeping in, but it remained frozen in its own era, its own memory. It remained a fracture in the landscape, an immovable reminder of the night when the boundaries between safety and terror dissolved. The more the world changed around it, the more the house felt like a place displaced from time. Its windows reflected light strangely, giving off the impression of depth rather than transparency. Birds never nested in its gutters. Insects avoided its cracks. Even nature seemed hesitant to embrace it. Years turned into decades, and investigators, historians, and enthusiasts revisited the case. They traced suspects, examined evidence, reinterpreted the crime. Some believed the killer had been a transient railroad worker. Some believed it had been a more personal crime. Others saw it as the work of a serial predator whose identity dissolved into time. But no theory satisfied the lingering questions. No theory explained the calmness of the intruder. No theory explained the coverings placed over mirrors. No theory explained the food untouched on the table. No theory explained the sense of ritual. No theory explained the attic's silent witness. The house remained the only caretaker of the truth, and it kept it hidden. By the late 20th century, the structure was restored and preserved for historical interest. But even restoration could not cleanse the atmosphere within. New boards and fresh paint did not diminish the old emotions. Tour guides who entered frequently spoke quietly, their voices low, as though afraid to disturb something unseen. Visitors felt their skin crawl the moment they crossed the threshold. Some sensed movement in peripheral vision. Some heard faint tapping upstairs. Some felt cold rushes that made no sense. A few fled abruptly, unable to endure the pressure. The attic especially drew reactions. People reported headaches, nausea, or a sense of crushing weight. A few felt sudden panic, as though surrounded. No one lingered. Even those who spoke confidently of skepticism found themselves glancing over their shoulders. The structure's age only deepened the sensation. Creaking wood, shifting air, and faint temperature drops melded with the emotional residue of tragedy, turning the house into something more than a historical site. It became a living artifact of horror, an echo chamber that replayed the night endlessly in a loop no one could escape. The townspeople accepted the house's reputation. They did not celebrate it. They did not deny it. They simply coexisted with it, aware that some places never returned to normal once touched by darkness. And so, the Moore house remained, years turning into decades, decades into a century. Sunlight fell across its facade. Leaves gathered along its porch in autumn. Snow settled silently on its roof in winter. Yet beneath each season, beneath each layer of time, the house remained tethered to June 10, 1912. Frozen. touching, remembering. The presence that once waited in its attic had long since vanished, but the imprint never faded. The structure had learned the nature of stillness, from the intruder who waited in silence for hours, from the victims who never woke, from the investigators who whispered in dread, from the townspeople who stood trembling beyond the porch. It became a vessel for that stillness, a house that inhaled tragedy and never exhaled it. The discovery of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls did not merely shock Villisca, it fractured it. The town, once ordinary and orderly, became a place suspended between disbelief and terror. Families locked doors at night for the first time. Parents watched children with unceasing vigilance. Conversations slowed, words clipped, eyes darting toward the White House at the corner that no longer belonged to them. Investigators arrived with seriousness and solemnity. They measured, recorded, and documented, yet every methodical action seemed to feed the house's oppressive atmosphere. The wooden floorboards groaned under their weight, responding not to mechanics, but to memory. The walls, saturated with anguish, resisted intrusion. Light seemed dimmer inside. Shadows lingered in corners longer than physics allowed. The first investigator to examine the attic hesitated, feeling the air thicken around him. He traced a finger across the floorboards where the intruder had waited and felt the cold snap of residual presence, a sensation that clawed along his spine. A veteran lawman tried to reassure himself it was imagination, yet his stomach clenched in understanding that the house held more than wood, more than air. It held remembrance. Outside, Villisca reacted in waves. Neighbors came to watch investigators enter and exit, whispering theories that grew increasingly dark. Some insisted the killer must have been a stranger, a drifter passing through with no name. Others, more cynical, claimed someone local, smiling among them each Sunday in church. Every theory was met with suspicion, rumor, and panic. No one could reconcile that a single night could yield such devastation. Local authorities interrogated anyone with a potential connection. They questioned neighbors, friends, employees, and strangers. They considered every lead. Among the primary suspects emerged the traveling preacher George Kelly. His presence in town coincided with the murders, and whispers of instability and obsession followed him. At one point he confessed, but quickly recanted, and the confession proved inconsistent. Even with public scrutiny, investigators could not place him definitively at the crime scene, though fear clung to his name. Other suspects appeared and vanished with the same spectral swiftness as the killer seemed to have had. Frank F. Jones, a local businessman with a rumored grudge against Josiah Moore, drew scrutiny, but evidence remained circumstantial. Henry Lee Moore, a convicted axe murderer from another state, entered national discussion for the potential of a serial killer on the loose. Yet each theory remained incomplete, unable to reconcile the precision, patience, and peculiar ritual evident in the crime. The house, meanwhile, refused to relinquish its grip. Every investigation seemed to feed it, saturating the air with tension. Footsteps that should have faded lingered. Doors that were opened and closed seemed to move with subtle intentionality afterward. Dust shifted in patterns too deliberate to be random. Visitors claimed to hear faint scratching, whispers, or sighs when alone in the rooms most affected by the murders. As weeks turned into months, the investigation reached no conclusion. Trial after trial faltered on lack of evidence, inconsistent testimonies, and the impossible nature of the crime itself. The town learned the limits of the law, the inability of human reasoning to parse the darkness that had entered the Moore household. Even when suspects were named, each disappeared from the narrative without closure. The absence of justice amplified fear. People believed that the house had absorbed the killer's intent, holding it as a silent warning. Each creak in the floor, each shadow flicker, became proof that evil could exist beyond detection. Villagers began to avoid the street entirely. Children dared one another to run past the house at sunset, and no one lingered once night approached. The structure had become a living monument, not of architecture, but of dread. Visitors described the interior as thick with memories. Some experienced sudden chills. Some claimed to feel an invisible pressure on their shoulders. Others reported hearing faint creaks or soft shuffles that could not be attributed to the wind or animals. Even skeptics felt unease, an intuitive recognition that this house remembered and waited. The attic remained the focal point of these reactions. The narrow space, once used to store boxes and belongings, radiated a peculiar weight. Those who ventured there often felt vertigo or sudden nausea. Some reported shadows moving at the periphery of vision, yet turning revealed nothing. One historian decades later described feeling eyes on every inch of me, yet no eyes existed. The experience was universal. The house did not just contain memory, it actively projected it. By the mid-20th century, the Moore House had begun to attract attention from true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators. They approached with cameras, notes, and instruments meant to measure unseen forces. Every attempt yielded evidence of discomfort: rapid drops in temperature, electrical interference, and even anecdotal auditory phenomena consistent across decades of visitors. Yet no definitive proof existed. The house defied capture. It existed as both artifact and enigma, untouchable in its full reality. Meanwhile, Villisca evolved. Technology, highways, and modernization expanded across Iowa. Families moved in and out. Businesses rose and fell. Yet the Moore House stood immutable, a persistent reminder that some events leave impressions no amount of time can erase. Children grew up with the story passed from generation to generation, learning early that this house was not ordinary. Teenagers dared one another to peek inside the windows, but few lingered. Adults avoided it entirely, feeling a primal awareness of its weight. The house seemed alive in subtle ways. Floorboards shifted unexpectedly. Doors closed with a faint finality. Shadows appeared heavier than warranted by the light. Air stagnated in certain rooms. The attic, in particular, resisted any intrusion. Investigators, historians, and casual visitors alike left with the same impression. The house had agency. It observed. It remembered. Did not forgive. In the decades that followed, the Moore House became more than a crime scene. It became a cultural symbol, a point where human tragedy intersected with lingering horror. Researchers wrote papers, historians documented events, and journalists revisited the case repeatedly, each attempt to unravel the mystery deepening the fascination. Yet the house retained a singular secret. The full truth was beyond human reach. The intruder's identity, motives, and methods remained forever elusive, preserved as part of the house's essence. Visitors described recurring sensations: a sense of being watched, sudden temperature shifts, inexplicable dizziness, or the faint perception of movement when alone. Some claimed whispers in corners or distant creaking echoing through empty rooms. Each report added to the legend but also fed the house itself, which seemed to thrive on attention, emotion, and fear. The Moore House's legend extended far beyond Villisca. It became an object of national intrigue, appearing in magazines, newspapers, and later television documentaries. Enthusiasts traveled hundreds of miles to witness its oppressive stillness firsthand. Their accounts were consistent. The house's interior seemed to resist intrusion, and the memory of its horrors lingered with astonishing intensity. By this point, the house had achieved a dual existence. Physically, it remained a structure of wood and paint. Psychologically, socially, and emotionally, it existed as a repository of horror, a presence that could never fully be contained or explained. It demonstrated that some tragedies are permanent, imprinted not only on memory but on the world itself. The Moore House came to embody a singular lesson. Human evil may be temporary in action, but the imprint it leaves can be eternal. The intruder's presence vanished long ago, yet the house preserved the intent, the violence, and the fear. Those who entered, even in curiosity or study, encountered a living echo, not a memory. The past was active, pressing, and undeniable. The house's endurance proved that some mysteries remain unsolved not due to lack of effort, but because they are beyond human comprehension. The patterns, the movements, the ritualistic aspects of the crime, and the intruder's calm, All defied understanding. They were locked into the walls, held in silence, and projected outward into anyone who dared to step inside. Visitors today, standing in the hallways once filled with laughter and light, often feel the weight of a century pressing down. The air carries tension, the floors respond, and shadows bend in ways impossible to explain. The house waits, and the visitor experiences it. In every creak, in every flicker of light, in every sigh of the wind, the presence of that night in 1912 lingers. The Moore family and the Stillinger girls' deaths remain unsolved. Suspects fade into history. Newspapers age in yellow. Investigators die, yet the house endures. It is a vessel, a monument, and a warning. The echoes of evil persist far beyond the lives that witnessed them, far beyond the justice that never came, far beyond the boundaries of time. No one can claim ownership of the past. No one can erase it. And the house will not relinquish it. As the years progressed, the Moore house became a place simultaneously feared and revered. Locals spoke of it only in whispers, careful not to attract attention. Some insisted the house itself was alive, not in a literal sense, but as a vessel of memory and intent. Even decades later, visitors reported that the air inside felt different, thickened with the weight of sorrow and unresolved violence. They described a sensation that went beyond fear. It was a sense that the house itself watched, assessed, and remembered each presence that dared enter its halls. Investigators over the years attempted to document this oppressive atmosphere, though their reports were cautious and clinical, avoiding speculation that could undermine credibility. Footnotes described drops in temperature in empty rooms, faint creaks in the floorboards, and shadows that seemed too deliberate to be caused by ambient light. Electrical devices malfunctioned without explanation. Cameras captured inexplicable dark smudges. Thermometers registered cold spots where no drafts existed. Still, these observations were secondary to the haunting truth. The house preserved the memory of that night in a form no instrument could fully quantify. For the town of Villisca, the Moore house was a permanent scar. Life carried on outside its walls, but the house cast a shadow over the community. Parents restricted children's movements. Families discussed the case with an air of quiet dread at church gatherings. Visitors from afar occasionally entered the town with curiosity, some leaving disoriented and shaken, others compelled to return again and again, unable to fully comprehend what had occurred. The house became a point of morbid pilgrimage, but the stories of its oppressive weight deterred anyone unprepared for the psychological toll of its interior. Some residents claimed the house influenced dreams, even of those who never stepped inside. Nightmares of shadowed hallways, the sound of an axe striking, or the feeling of being watched haunted people across town. The event had imprinted itself so deeply into the community's collective consciousness that even the passage of generations could not entirely remove its effect. Children grew up learning of the murders not merely as history, but as living presence, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of daily life. Those who entered the house reported subtler details, the kind that cannot be captured in words. One visitor, decades after the original tragedy, described the sensation of walls closing in on him, the air itself pressing down. Another spoke of faint laughter echoing from the children's bedroom, so clear and dissonant in contrast to the silence that it left him reeling. Shadows did not just move. They lingered, seeming to wait in corners and doorways, as though rehearsing the final movements of the killer who had once occupied the house. The attic remained the focal point of unease. Though long cleared of the boxes and personal effects once stored there, it retained an almost magnetic pull for those sensitive to its energy. Anyone entering felt a sudden, inexplicable vertigo. The narrower space amplified the oppressive presence, as if the house itself compressed the memories, concentrating them in one singular, unbearable location. Some visitors reported whispers they could not locate, soft but insistent, almost guiding them toward understanding, though no understanding ever emerged. By the mid-20th century, the Moore house began attracting the attention of historians, writers, and paranormal researchers. Documentaries and books chronicled the murders, often drawing on oral testimonies from townspeople. Each retelling, however, seemed to reinforce the house's oppressive presence, as if recounting the story revived the memory within the walls. Witnesses described doors shifting slightly, shadows stretching, or the floorboards creaking under invisible weight, subtle evidence that the house absorbed not just the events, but also the emotions surrounding them. The house's continued influence was felt most acutely by those who spent extended periods inside. Researchers often reported anxiety, cold sweats, or a sense of time slowing. Sleep became difficult after visits. Dreams were filled with images of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls, often intertwined with impossible distortions of the house's hallways and rooms. One scholar claimed that the walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly under his perception. Whether these experiences were psychological or supernatural, the pattern was consistent. The house left a permanent impression, one that could not be ignored. Local residents, meanwhile, maintained a cautious relationship with the house. Even generations removed from the original tragedy, families avoided the street at night. Teenagers dared one another to approach its windows, but few lingered. For them, the house was not merely a structure. It was a repository of unanswerable questions, a reminder of human vulnerability, and a site where innocence and violence collided with irreversible consequences. In time, the Moore house became both a historical artifact and a psychological enigma. Restoration efforts were undertaken to preserve the structure, but they did not diminish the sensations within. Fresh paint, repaired floors, and new windows could not erase the lingering memory of trauma. Visitors continued to report cold spots, sudden dizziness, and the sensation of being watched. Even when the building was empty, the house seemed alive, filled with the echoes of that night and the subtle, ever-present weight of human fear. In the 1970s and 1980s, Villisca embraced its role as a destination for those drawn to the true crime narrative. Tours were organized, allowing visitors to enter the house under supervision. Yet the experiences described remained eerily consistent. Oppressive atmospheres, sudden temperature changes, faint sounds, and shadows that seemed to resist explanation. Scholars and paranormal enthusiasts documented these phenomena rigorously, but their reports were invariably framed as anomalies, never fully capturing the house's ability to sustain dread. The Moore house also influenced the broader understanding of unsolved crimes and their psychological impact. It became a case study in the endurance of trauma, demonstrating how a single night of violence could leave an indelible mark not just on individuals, but on a physical space. Architects, psychologists, and criminologists cited the house in discussions of environmental memory. The idea that places could carry emotional and historical residues that persist across time. Despite, or perhaps because of, its infamy, the house remained remarkably intact. Unlike abandoned homes that crumble with neglect, the Moore house preserved its form. This structural fidelity reinforced the impression of suspended time. The house seemed to exist outside normal temporal boundaries, retaining the physical characteristics of the early 20th century while maintaining the psychological weight of the murders. It became an impossible bridge between past and present, tangible and intangible, memory and reality. Visitors, researchers, and townspeople all experienced the same central truth. The house did not forgive, it did not forget, and it did not release the echoes of that night, no matter how much time passed. Even in contemporary times, the house continued to draw attention. Photographers and documentarians captured its exterior and interior with modern equipment, yet the stories remained consistent. Those who spent hours inside reported feeling watched. Shadows seemed to stretch toward them. The floorboards shifted subtly beneath their feet. The attic remained the epicenter of unease, a concentrated node of fear that no restoration or modernization could dispel. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Moore house had achieved a status that transcended local legend. It became a symbol of enduring human tragedy, the persistence of unsolved crime, and the haunting power of place. Visitors understood instinctively that this was not merely a house. It was a container of memory, a vessel of fear, a monument to lives taken too early and violence that defied comprehension. The psychological impact on Villisca was permanent. Even residents who had no personal connection to the Moore family experienced unease when passing the house. Its presence was woven into the collective consciousness of the town, a silent sentinel reminding all who lived there of the fragility of life and the incomprehensibility of certain acts. And so the Moore house endured, not merely as architecture, not merely as history, but as an entity. It watched, it remembered. It preserved the night of unspeakable violence in every board, every corner, every shadow. Those who entered its halls felt the weight of that memory. Those who passed its windows sensed the gaze of a house that would never release what it had absorbed. The house refused to forget, and in doing so, it became eternal. Decades passed, but the Moore house never relinquished its hold over Villisca. It remained at the center of a lingering unease, an impervious relic of a night that would never fade from memory. Every visitor, whether historian, thrill-seeker, or casual tourist, sensed the oppressive weight immediately upon crossing the threshold. Even with modern lighting, cameras, and structural renovations, the house seemed to resist ordinary perception, its atmosphere thick with a presence that could neither be seen nor touched, yet was impossible to ignore. The attic, the epicenter of terror, continued to evoke profound discomfort. Scholars described vertigo, nausea, and feelings of suffocating pressure upon entering, as though the very air had thickened over the decades. One visitor reported that the narrow staircase ascending to the attic seemed longer than physics allowed, stretching in impossible ways, each step pressing a cold weight upon the chest. Shadows appeared to linger, even when sunlight penetrated the windows, and faint noises echoed through the rafters. Scratches, shuffles, soft thuds, as if the night itself had carved into the wood. Psychologists who studied the effects of trauma and place cited the Moore house repeatedly. It became a unique case study in environmental memory. The idea that locations can absorb, retain, and even project the emotional and psychological weight of historical events. Unlike typical haunted narratives, the Moore house's influence was not dependent on imagination alone. Consistent experiences across generations suggested that the house's presence was tangible, its effect measurable, and its power enduring. Tourists and paranormal investigators often described a sensation of being watched, even in empty rooms. Objects seemed to move slightly when unobserved. Cold spots and sudden temperature fluctuations were reported regularly. The floorboards in certain areas creaked without any discernible cause. Even cameras and electronic devices failed intermittently, as though some unseen force disrupted their function. Every account reinforced the house's reputation. The Moore house was not merely a place of memory, it was a living repository of the night's terror. The stories of the victims, Josiah and Sarah Moore, the 4 Moore children, and the Stillinger girls, remained central to the narrative. Their lives, abruptly ended, became immortalized through the house itself. Visitors reported sensing their presence, not as malevolent spirits but as residual echoes of trauma, watching silently from the spaces where they had last been alive. Footsteps were heard where none could be accounted for, cold air passed over the bodies of guests, and the faint scent of smoke or wood lingered, an intangible reminder of the violence that had occurred. Even the wider community carried the house's shadow. Locals spoke of it quietly, passing warnings and stories to children and newcomers. Families altered their routines, avoiding the street after dusk. The story of the Moore house was woven into the town's identity, a cautionary tale of the fragility of life and the permanence of evil. The murders were unsolved, and the identity of the intruder remained a haunting question mark, ensuring that the mystery and the fear would endure indefinitely. The Moore house, over time, became a pilgrimage site for those drawn to the macabre. Documentarians, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts traveled hundreds of miles to witness the building firsthand. Their accounts consistently included the same chilling details: oppressive atmosphere, shifting shadows, unexplained noises, and an inexplicable sense of surveillance. Some left shaken, others returned, compelled to experience the sensation again. But all acknowledged one undeniable truth: the house held its history with deliberate care, preserving the terror of June 10, 1912, as though it were carved into the wood and plaster. Restoration efforts, while preserving the physical structure, did nothing to alleviate the house's power. Fresh paint and new flooring could not purge the memory embedded within. Those sensitive to its atmosphere reported immediate discomfort. The house seemed to judge, to measure the intrusion, to respond subtly to each presence. Some visitors felt nausea, dizziness, or intense anxiety. Others reported fleeting glimpses of shadow, movement at the edge of vision, or faint whispers that vanished when directly addressed. Even in the digital age, with advanced technology and scientific investigation, the Moore house resisted explanation. Thermal cameras revealed cold spots with no apparent source. Electromagnetic sensors fluctuated erratically. Microphones picked up faint, indistinct sounds. Yet nothing definitively identified the cause. The house remained an enigma, an intersection of history, memory, and fear. Its influence extended beyond the physical. Locals reported dreams of the house, of the murders, and of its silent, unyielding presence. Even those who had never entered its doors experienced nightmares or unease when hearing the story. The house had become a symbol, not merely of tragedy, but of the persistent, inescapable echo of violence. Some historians suggested that the Moore house existed as a cautionary monument, a reminder that certain acts, especially those of deliberate cruelty, leave permanent traces in the world. The structure's endurance served as a testament to this principle. The murders had not ended with the intruder's exit. They had not concluded with the discovery of the bodies. They had been imprinted on the very essence of the house, making it both a witness and a repository, a monument to lives lost and the terror endured. The townspeople, though long removed from the original event, remained aware. Children grew up with the story as a somber fixture. Teenagers dared each other to touch the door or peek through windows, but fear prevented prolonged observation. Adults passed the street with uneasy glances, an acknowledgement that some events cannot be forgotten, no matter the years. The Moore house had outlasted generations. Its boards, paint, and beams were old, but the memory of violence within was fresher than ever. It retained the intruder's meticulous calm, the abrupt loss of life, and the residual dread. Every person who entered became part of the narrative, their fear absorbed and stored, their unease feeding the atmosphere. By the present day, the Moore house is preserved as a historical site. Visitors are allowed entry under supervision, yet reports of unease remain consistent. Cold spots, subtle movements, pressure on the chest, whispers, fleeting shadows. The house does not merely recall history, it enforces it, projecting the horror of June 10, 1912 into the present. It is a place of memory and dread, where time has no dominion over the echoes of violence. It exists simultaneously as a monument to unsolved murder and as a psychological enigma, compelling anyone who enters to reckon with the incomprehensible. Those who witness it leave changed, aware of the house's silent assertion. Some acts are never erased, and some places will never release the weight they have absorbed. The Moore house is more than wood and plaster. It is an eternal witness. It is a vessel of memory. It is a cautionary testament to the fragility of life and the permanence of evil. It remembers, and it refuses to forgive. If you felt the chill of this story, make sure to subscribe to Silent Scream Chronicles and hit the notification bell. Dive deeper into the world's darkest true tales, where every story has shadows waiting in the corners, and every house has a memory it refuses to forget.